All right, hello, welcome back to a special, edition of the Discourse Education podcast. So the thing is that we already filmed our episode 4. It's on the recent Lazada retrenchments that occurred in Singapore, as well as the recent Supreme Court ruling on Bristol Bay. But yeah, we got our first question. So, exciting times. All right. Here we go. So this question came from an anonymous poster. They simply asked, what do you have any tips on evaluation, right? What other strategies are there besides, writing a counter argument and a rebuttal? So, great question. All right. This is something that, I suppose many students struggle with, right? Assuming you're not struggling with communicating your points in silos in the first place or breaking down the question requirements. So this question, or rather the answer to this question is really meant to help get your answers to a higher level of response, right? And this works for pretty much most art subjects, so be it general paper, H2 history. I'm not too sure about economics because I don't teach that subject, but I presume, if you want to achieve a deeper level of analysis, this may help because ultimately, evaluation is really about making use of thinking frameworks and different perspectives to look at your argument as a whole and to flesh it out in a more holistic manner. So for those who are wondering like what this question or whoever that thank you for the question, right? Whoever that posted this question, what are they referring to in terms of a CA and rebuttal? All right. So because different schools use different terminologies, all right, and consequently what this person may refer to as a counter argument and rebuttal may mean different things for others. So essentially what this person is asking about is that most likely, right, you are taught by your school to do something like this, all right. Let's say I have a supporting argument. Okay. A supporting argument that essentially supports the question's thesis. All right. Pardon me for my horrible handwriting. It has been destroyed by, when I was a kid, doing H2 history. Yeah, never really recovered from that. So, and then a counter argument here. All right. So in other words, fleshing out the antithesis, I guess, so challenges the questions thesis. Okay, and then what this person is saying, rebuttal, right? So rebuttal, i.e., they can either do it in a couple of ways, either at the end of the second paragraph. So over here, we are essentially talking about the limitations of the counter argument. So for instance, if let's say I were to come up with an antithesis to a question to like to what extent should the government take care of all welfare needs of the people, right? The counter argument can be something like not all of it, right? At least not to the extent where the government literally dictates an individual or a community's choices of diets, so dietary choices, their lifestyle, so how much exercise they need to do per day. So we are countering the argument in terms of the extent of government intervention, right, in a person's life. But at the same time, the limitations of the argument is that as much as the government shouldn't intervene to that degree, okay, it should still set up some systems in place that would help, encourage people to live a healthier lifestyle, or so that the healthcare burdens on the national healthcare system wouldn't be too great, right? So that essentially is what the person is saying over here. So either evaluating it at the end of the paragraph or just an entire paragraph on its own. And many schools call this the rebuttal. Essentially rebutting your counter argument, right? Your antithesis, so as to undermine it and then in turn strengthen your supporting argument. Now the thing is that the way that okay, I should phrase this next part carefully. In many cases, then there is a misunderstanding of the instruction. So what students might assume is that, oh, what that means then is that every single time your thesis statement must be a supporting argument. That's not true, all right? So this person is asking me, you're asking me here, what other strategies are there besides counter argument and rebuttal? All right, here's what I would say. Okay, there are a few ways to go about doing this, and we want to look at it from a smaller or micro level and a macro level. So on the micro level, right, and I don't mean like microeconomics or whatever, I'm talking about the scale of your argument, like literally in terms of the structure of the essay itself. So like what I said just now, you can either evaluate at the end of the paragraph. So first, we are going to look at the paragraph level first. All right. So on the paragraph level, what you can do to evaluate your argument is to think of it in these particular ways, because at the end of the day, evaluation, as I said earlier, is about pointing out the limitations of your argument, which in turn necessitates a lot of questioning on your own part, questioning in terms of asking questions of the viability of your argument itself. So we can think of it in terms of, let's say, are there other causes or impacts? All right. So we can look at it in terms of the cause and effect framework. All right. The thing is that we don't usually do this, because if you can flesh out other causes and other impacts, assuming it's a cause and effect question, right? Why wouldn't you expand it in a separate paragraph altogether? So yeah, but nevertheless, this is one strategy that you can do, i.e. you evaluate at the end of your paragraph whether there are any other causes or any other impacts of the phenomenon that you're trying to flesh out. The second one would be different stakeholders, right? And even then, you can also look at it from a smaller level, individual or communal or a societal level. So if we say something like, it is necessary to change consumption habits to curb, environmental troubles, right? So in other words, changing our consumption style, our lifestyle habits, so on and so forth, to reduce waste, to reduce energy needs, to reduce carbon output in general. But you can also think of it in terms of, hey, if individuals have a role to play, i.e. the consumer side of things, if they have a role to play, then your suppliers definitely need to step in as well, because yes, demand drives supply, right? So getting into a little bit of an econ stuff here, demand drives supply, but in reality, a lot of times the suppliers also create demand. And that usually occurs when, if let's say you have a product that is so highly coveted, right? Or i.e. a new innovation that will drive consumers to want to purchase it. Of course, assuming that a lot of market research has been done, underpinning the conceptualization and the production itself. But yeah, so individuals versus communal, right? In other words, different stakeholders, what sort of part do they play? What are the impacts that may be different on all these different stakeholders, all right? Yeah. Another one would be something like other, are there other nuances to the subject matter itself? Okay. So this one is a bit general, obviously, but certainly we can break it down further. So things like, if we can think of it in terms of limitations of government intervention, we can think of it in terms of, uh, uh, individual behaviors. All right. We can also think of it in terms of, different communal perceptions, which is kind of an overlap with the different stakeholders thing, but we are really focusing on the perceptions of it. And my favorite one, because this is the one that, well, it just so happens that I personally like this the most. That would be, that would be different contexts. And by different contexts, I mean different epochs. All right. So different eras, essentially different societies, different situations. So for instance, if let's say we make a statement like, more should indeed be done to improve the mental health of young people in general, right? And then we can evaluate it by saying that, but at the same time, we must be aware of the context in itself in terms of communicating, the strategies to improve their mental health. Because if let's say we are talking about trying to improve the mental health of young people today versus how it was like in the past, so even let's say we are talking about two different generations that are not that far apart, like your Gen Z and millennials, right? So the mental health needs of millennials, right? So i.e. my generation. Okay, so yes, I'm a millennial, all right. And the Gen Z, so ranging from those who are currently still, in like the late stages of high school or pre-U, right? Versus, those who just started working, right? Yeah, there are nuances there because then we need to consider all, the technological context, right? Why is it that people are becoming so much more anxious, right, because of technology or whatever other increasingly volatile world sort of analysis that you can bring in. So these are just some strategies here on a paragraph level, all right? In terms, yeah, on a paragraph level. Now on an essay wide level, this is a lot harder to explain simply because it is entirely dependent on the subject matter itself. But essentially, from in terms of the essay level, right? You can either, all right, ways to evaluate. You can either do what the original question is asking about, which is, you have a paragraph. Oh, this is totally bringing up primary school math trauma for me. Uh, Yeah, math is not my favorite thing. But anyway, you have two paragraphs here, right? Support counter. Okay, and then you evaluate by rebutting the second paragraph. That's one way, a very viable way to do it. Or what you can do is you can evaluate by pointing out the undercurrents, all right, of everything, and that is the underpinning context. And that's why I say this is my favorite or go-to method, because so many things in life, is contextual in nature, and it is incredibly important for us to understand that, not just in your academics, but also in your personal life, right? Essentially, the idea is that you can flesh out different perspectives, on this one subject matter. But at the end of the day, right, the underpinning context, how does it then tie or affect everything? How does it tie everything together? Or how does it affect everything? I don't know what's wrong with my drawing pad. It's not working optimally. So what do I mean by this? So for instance, right, if let's say we wanna look at if let's say I have an argument, that says let's say, right. So if we have a question on IR, for instance, international relations, nations cooperation between nations is impossible. Let's say we have a question like that, right? Cooperation between nations is impossible. Okay. You can say something like, it can be possible, uh, especially in times whereby you have humanitarian crisis, be it due to disasters or just crappy things happening like what's going on in Israel right now. And then you can also say not really, right? Because of conflicting economic needs. So for instance, China and US, right? The ongoing sort of like trade war that's still going on between them, and how when it comes to security, USA essentially came out with the concept of the Indo-Pacific a couple of years ago. I'll encourage you to go and read that up. It's a very interesting concept. Yeah, so you have 2 points there, right, that point out, hey, cooperation can be possible in this one context. Conflicting economic needs, which is another context, can make cooperation impossible, right? But what is the undercurrent through all these things? And you can say something like, at the end of the day, cooperation is not entirely impossible, right? Because the question takes a very absolute stance, but it is dependent on the situation. And what is it dependent on? It is ultimately dependent on, and this is a concept that H2 history students would be very familiar with eventually, dependent on national interests. And you can evaluate by pointing out that, hey, this is how our world system is like. We, if let's say we look at how the global geopolitical system is constructed, you are talking about different nations, right? Different imagined communities, Benedict Anderson, and they all fundamentally would always behave in such a way that would protect their own interests. Whatever interests those may be is dependent on the nation itself, right? So like for instance, in Singapore, we make friends with everybody because our main economic interest is in establishing trade ties between different nations and establishing diplomatic relations altogether, right? So that's another way that you can evaluate, essentially taking the underpinning context that runs through all your points and connecting them together, right? That also helps you do a connection of ideas at the same time, i.e., how your points address one another. That's a very, very important requirement in the new GP syllabus. All right. But more on that perhaps another day. And the last one really is again dependent on the question itself, but I would say something like this. You can question the question. All right. So usually where do we do this then? If let's say we talk about the contextual evaluation, right, on an essay level, this I would do it as a final body paragraph, or you can put it in the conclusion. Here, I will only put this in the conclusion. All right. Essentially, what we are doing here is we are questioning the question's thesis in the first place and its viability. So it'll be something like, let's say, you know, um, mm, mm. So if let's say we have a question like, the gender pay gap will always exist, right? Or actually, no. The gender pay gap is a myth, all right? You can have supporting and counter arguments for this question's thesis, certainly. And then you can also take on the contextual sort of evaluation, right? Because ultimately, yes, the gap exists, but there's a lot of nuance that has to go into the analysis there, right? So understanding the sort of population in different jobs, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, you can say that the gender pay gap is not really a myth, okay? But, or rather, you can question this idea in the first place, okay? You can question this idea, right, in your conclusion. Now, some students may wonder, like, hey, isn't this then not answering the question? Kind of, but at the same time, we are also fleshing out deeper nuances to this particular topic at hand. That's why I say I'll only do this in a conclusion. So I'll do something like, is gender pay gap really a myth? That's one way. So it is not, it is not a myth. Oh gosh. Yep, time to upgrade. Or I can also question this in terms of, the idea of gender in the wider world, whether we agree with it or not, is becoming more and more fluid, because of the rise of, your LGBTQ community, and all that. So that in itself, you can also question the question's thesis, unless you are just purely defining the gender pay gap as strictly between two genders. So, yeah, these are just some ways. Obviously, I can't really elaborate further without showing you, fully written suggested essays and proper examples. But if I do that, I rather you just come for a free trial lesson or continue with us for the longer term in having, or rather in taking our tuition services, right? be it for general paper or for H2 history. So yeah, all these methods can definitely work for all the other art subjects. You can use it for econs, no problem. You can use it for H2 history. Of course, for the H2 subjects, it is definitely more limiting because there is a prescribed sort of topic or interpretation for you to go and look at, and the questions will be set accordingly. So, I mean, general paper, as its name suggests, it's general. So there are many, many perspectives that we can take. For economics, typically in Singapore, how teachers teach it is from a top-down perspective. So institutional approaches. So usually when we evaluate, it will be along those lines. And for H2 history, likewise, right? And obviously, depending on the subject matter, if you are talking about, let's say, the economic growth of Japan, right? You can evaluate, but within the confines of the concepts within that topic in itself. So, you can't really evaluate it by saying like something like oh, the private businesses were far more significant because they took the choice to go and break away from the Keiretsu system and so on and so forth. It's a bit suspect if you do it that way, but the general idea is still the same. You can use it. And yeah, hope this answers the question. And for anyone else who would like to, get, I guess, answers to their questions, you can simply, submit a question using the link below, right? And yeah, see you guys next time.